Hey, and welcome back to Thinking About the Question. For all those who subscribed, you know where we are. And for those who haven't, please subscribe and you'll find us again. And what we're doing is ever, we're talking about stuff which is in the news, in the media. We're talking about issues which matter. And we're trying to go a bit deeper with it. And this time we're really on the subject of mental health. There's a lot of going around mental health and mental health inquiries. And we're very lucky in a sense because Musa is a consultant psychiatrist, so he's giving his point of view on it. I'm just a social anthropologist asking my normal questions.
Jonathan, I'm more interested in the social anthropologist than the consultant psychiatrist.
I know, but that's how it
Yeah,
goes. And
yeah,
and what you said also is, in a sense, what we're talking about
mm,
is just everyday business for you. For me, it's quite fascinating because I'm not aware of a lot of it, or I'm aware of bits of it, but I can't quite see the picture. And I mean, we spent the whole of the last episode, we were discussing, what serious mental illness is, how that differs from sort of mental illness. We were discussing this issue of psychosis and how that's
yeah,
sort of diagnosed and where schizophrenia fits in that. We looked at the issue of harm, self harm within that, and violent propensities to violence. Uh, and we looked at society's responsibilities of patient care and what should happen and what does happen. And we've sort of finished the conversation. We'd taken a look at harm towards oneself, but now I wanted to take the conversation really to what happens where these inquiries are. There's been an inquiry up in Southport. There's this inquiry in Nottingham, and every so often we have a public inquiry into a case of mental health where someone who is suffering from some sort of serious mental illness uh, violently attacks or kills uh, members of the public or people they possibly knew. And I'm trying to understand what that is within these contexts. And today, what I'd like to do now is really go through that a bit more, understand what this violence is, and I also want to understand who we are in relationship to that violence. If you want the anthropological thing, what does that violence tell us about us, the way we react to it, and what's important in it? But as these inquiries go on, I just see sort of big headlines of everyone fails. It's all failings, failings, failings. And it was horrific and innocent people killed by someone we don't even have a name for them. They're so other. We can't quite bring ourselves to name them. There's some abhorrence going on, but at the same time, we understand they're ill. So I'd really like to explore that with you if that's possible. Uh,
of course. Jonathan, but let me turn the question back on
mm,
you. In the last podcast, you were telling me that you've been hearing these things since you were young. They've kind of punctuated your life,
which
well,
things? Just
about kind of stories of somebody with a serious mental health
mm,
condition run amok, as it were. In fact, amok is a psychiatric condition. It's what's called a culture. It's called a culture bound syndrome, right? Um, what you might not be able to recall back, but what kind of things had you heard before? What was the kind of overall take? You don't need to give me the details, but just the overall feeling that you're left with.
my feeling, and that's just who
As
I
you
am.
as you were growing up, just as a member of the British public, and you hear about these stories, they're obviously in the newspapers and these kind of things. What kind of things? What are the kind of messages coming out of them?
So my sense was that they happen. I mean, when I was younger, I wasn't that aware of it.
Mm,
Then, because as I said, we lived very near a sort of psychiatric hospital, so there was parental advice about what to do with
okay.
the loonies, as they were called, from the lunatic asylum. So there was the man who directed the traffic, and we were told, "Don't worry, he's not really directing the traffic, and if he ever tells you to do something, you don't have to do it, kids." Um, but that was sort of the interaction with it all, and don't go into the hospital. along with don't go into a whole load of other places. That's what you're
Sure.
constantly taught as a kid. And then I think the one that hits me because I was living in Finsbury Park when Jonathan Zito was
Okay.
killed. So that was the local station. So that was like it was very
Oh
close to it
wow.
was close to
Okay.
home. It wasn't that close to home because there's thousands of people pouring in and out of the station.
Mm.
You're just aware of it. It's in the background. And I think at that age also there's a slight well, for me, there was a slight disconnection. I remember going through King's Cross when the King's Cross fire happened and the train stopped and the doors
Mm.
didn't open. I was a bit frustrated, and the train just then carried on going. And I later heard about the fire. I was like, oof, that's what was going on. But I didn't quite connect the horror of it. Uh, and yes, as I've got older, I sort of notice these cases and I see them as unfortunate. I don't, I don't actually in my head, as I rationalise it, I go, that was preventable. I have no idea. I have no idea. I don't know how it works, but I know they happen occasionally. And as I
Do
say, I've
you?
worked in mental health a bit, so I kind of
Mm.
had a rough idea of very rough statistics, but that's it.
Do you remember the Bonkers Bruno headline?
Oh, but Frank Bruno going bonkers. That's
You
right.
remember that? Do you
Yeah.
remember that? That happened. Um, that happened the weekend before I started medical school.
Long
And
time ago.
yeah, I remember it because the first ever medical lecture I had, they brought in this inspirational speaker, who was a doctor, who was going to tell us about what it was like to be a doctor, and he decided to make it about medical confidentiality. And of course, the thing is that Frank Bruno's confidentiality had been massively violated, right? So what had happened at that time, and I think I could talk about this because it's so much on the public record, is Frank Bruno, who's a world heavyweight champion, and a darling
Was he?
of.
He wasn't. I don't think he ever
Was
won.
it? No, he wasn't. He wasn't. He
No.
wasn't. I think he fought Mike
He
Tyson as
both. He did fight.
a darling of Britain
Mm-hmm.
at the
Yeah.
time. Um, had had an episode of bipolar affective disorder. Had mania. This was many years after his physical peak. Um, and the paramedics came out. The ambulance was called, I believe, and they took him off to. They got him off to hospital, and it must have been one of the paramedics or somebody else, maybe some bystander in the public, who told the son. I think it
Mm-hmm.
was the son, and
Mm-hmm.
this alliteration, bonkers Bruno,
Mm-hmm.
and the picture of him being carted off, as I recall, it was at the newsstands, and this was a time, Jonathan, when you walk down the high street, and you would see all the headlines, outside each
Yeah.
newsstand, each shop, so everybody knew what was going on. It was an advertisement, and essentially the story, the subliminal message to all of that was an aggressive, young, not so young at that time, black man who had lost his mind. Do you know how damaging that was? I mean, for the national psyche, and for Mr. Bruno himself, I'm sure.
I want to come back to that. I want to,
Sure.
if that's all right. I think you make a very good point, and I'd like to build into it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I want to come back to where we left last time, which was this issue of violence. How
Mm.
how does because as you say, here was a story of Frank Bruno. Because the other side of the Frank Bruno story is it was also a fall of celebrity. It was also funny
Mm.
because lovable Frank had gone bonkers. It was funny, even though it wasn't funny for Frank or those who
Mm.
know him. So, how does violence develop in mental health? Is there a sort of slow progression? Is it such a sudden? Is it repetitive? What's the pattern? Is there a pattern?
Uh, you have to take each individual case on its own merits. But I've always said this, and I mean, I must have said this to you 10 times already. I'll say it again. There is no, I've never come across anything in mental health which is just purely ununderstandable. You know, I did a year in forensic psychiatry, and I reviewed all these cases, of this what appeared to be random violence by, schizophrenic or bipolar patients. I had to do the reports, I had to present in front of the tribunals, managers' hearings, these kind of things. what happens is a accumulation of risk factors and a number of things coming together, including kind of mental state, including often a fear of threat or a worry of persecution or a need to protect one's own safety or integrity. The exact story differs at different times. A certain level of disinhibition because of an unwell mental state, and perhaps sometimes, not exclusively, sometimes aided with alcohol or cannabis use or so on and so forth, which results in a very understandable situation of how the violence came to be. You can always understand the violence. It doesn't mean you accept it or you think that's the correct thing to happen, but it can always be understood if you look at the contextual factors and what was going on for that person that day.
So you're saying there isn't such a thing as random violence. These
I've,
random acts aren't so random.
I've, Jonathan, I've not seen it. Honestly, I've not seen it. There's always an explanation.
So what's the randomness that we experience? Because you started, well, last week's episode, you started talking about the innocent people who were killed. For them, it was random, wasn't it?
Of course, it's random as experienced by us. But it's not random if you look at, and that's part of the juxtaposition of this whole inquiry, isn't it? This was random violence happening in the streets of Nottingham. People who should have been safe to walk around the streets at night, and of course, people should be safe, right? There's no question about that. There were innocent people who weren't involved in this at all, right? And they experience it as random violence, and their loved ones experience it as random violence. But if you look at the actual care that was being provided to the individual, it's not random at all. It's a series of a sequence of one could say missteps or missed opportunities, which have slowly but inexorably led to this awful tragedy. So it's not random from his point of view or for the people who were caring for him. There's a certain grim predictability. This is obviously a case that we can see now with the benefit of hindsight. But I certainly remember being in forensic psychiatry and seeing case after case after case where you could just see, you could look backwards and you could see how the whole story develops. And Jonathan, I dealt with some terrible stories, but it was never random.
So you're describing it almost like a plane accident. So a plane
Yeah.
accident, one of the things we do is we start taking it apart because a plane accident is very rare, but its effects are very devastating. There's a lot of people involved, and then it's taken apart, and part of plane investigation is far in advance of many other forms of reflective inquiry. It tries to narrow down all these factors that took place. What you're saying is, if these things were plane crashes, we'd be waiting for the black box, we'd be waiting for the investigation. But because we don't see it that way, because we see it as a random act of violence by a bonkers person, we don't look to see all the factors that took place. They're irrelevant, or if they do, we're going to single out the ones that are important to our own position.
To be fair, Jonathan, I mean, after what's called a SUI, which is a serious untoward illness, a serious untoward incident occurs in healthcare settings, there is something called a root cause analysis, right? Those ideas and those principles have actually been taken from aviation safety, because it's known that aviation safety, is one of the most safe sectors in the world, and they're a model and a leader for us in mental health services or health services as well. However, one of the problems in kind of these kind of incidents is there's too much noise, Jonathan. Even in this inquiry, I'm only going to peripherally touch on aspects of this inquiry. There's God knows how many reports. The CQC have done a report. The trust has done an internal report. Other people have done other reports. There's this inquiry going on, right? There's too much noise. There's too many voices, right? Everybody has their own particular view about what went on, what went wrong. Some of those voices should be prioritized, others less prioritized. You know, and therefore it's very difficult to get to. Hopefully, the chair of the inquiry can weave through all of this, manage all of this, and give us some kind of curated narrative and explanation of events. But I do worry about whether we're really going to get there. And I can give you some examples of some things, just one or two. I won't go into detail, where I am worried about, the wrong messages have been taken up.
What do you mean by the wrong messages have been
I'll,
taken?
I'll give you a very, very simple
And then I want to
example.
come back to the issue of violence, but carry on.
I'll give you a very simple example. Um, in this particular inquiry, and this is a matter of public record, and it's less about what's being said in the inquiry and more how it's being reported upon. In this particular inquiry, at some point when considering whether or not to detain the individual concerned under the Mental Health Act, a doctor made a comment about that there were very many young black men detained under the Mental Health Act. And this is true. This is absolutely true. Actually, the same conclusion is there in the Zito report, from 34, 35 years ago, right? It's not changed, right? This has been reported as, okay, after this, this individual was detained 4 times under the Mental Health Act. There may be lots of failings. There may have been even failings in the determination whether or not to detain that individual at that specific time or not. But what is completely untrue is to say that because of DEI or because people are afraid or to section people who are black, we're just letting people out on the streets to murder and kill people. And that's exactly how it has been reported time and time again, in much of the right wing press and by reputed outlets. This I worry about. There's too much noise. You need to have some way of saying that, look, this is actually what's gone on, and filtering out the the stuff which isn't useful. I'm very worried about this, Jonathan.
But I can understand how this
Yeah,
develops, and there's parallels here,
yeah,
which is just quite odd. I mean, one, we have this parallel with the black box of a flight, which
mm,
gives us the heart of what's going on inside the plane, but it doesn't tell us about all the maintenance systems or the security systems, all these other systems that feed into it, or the manufacture of parts. It doesn't tell us any of that. It just tells us one little bit, and of course, once that's released, we this becomes very popular to listen to the cockpit thing, because if it's a part that's been poorly manufactured, then that's just not nearly as good to consume, and it's not nearly as human in a sense as these
mm,
voices trying to sort out a problem. But this other thing you're talking about, which is there's an inquiry, there's a lot of voices, and there's things that should be heard and things that really shouldn't be heard. We're almost drawing parallels with this thing you described as psychosis, with the disordered, confused patterns of thought, of delusions, and it's not quite the same, but there's
Jonathan,
parallels there.
you're right. You should be a novelist, or this is a good
But
plot within a
I
subplot.
won't
Yeah,
be the only person to notice this as you're
yeah, yeah.
talking. But I'm just drawing attention
You're
to it.
absolutely right.
So,
Yeah.
but I mean, within that, you see, you say there's this issue with. Look, one of the reasons we're doing this podcast, thinking around the question, is we have noticed that when things are discussed, they're discussed out of context, or they're discussed through one line of inquiry, or they're discussed with one thing, and that's very captivating and it's very engrossing. And of course, if we then market it and turn it into clickbait or to lovely
Yeah.
headlines, then it's even more captivating. Or if we create a story of conflict, it grips us, because the ways of storytelling haven't changed over years. But within that, within mental health, how then do we deal with this issue of the over sectioning of black men in mental health, because we're back to this idea of, if all these professionals who are making these diagnoses, and they're professional people and they're doctors, are making a diagnosis, it must be correct. And if we're saying that men who are black, are men who are black are more prevalent to mental health problems, or is it the condition of living as a sort of minority group within a country doing it, or is it that the doctors are bringing their own prejudices as they're doing it, or is there something we're not understanding about black mental health? Now we're into 4 or 5 different things before we've got anywhere.
Okay.
So,
That,
so,
yeah.
so, so it sort of leaves me with a question there, which is, how do we deal with it? And then there's the politicization of it around that.
Of
How
course.
can we have that
So,
discussion?
well, one of the things I find fascinating is I went back and read the report, the Zeta report. You know, I can't remember if this is called the Zeta report or the Christopher Clunas inquiry. Yeah, Christopher Clunas was the individual who had killed Jonathan Zeta. At the end of it, this is so sad. It's heartbreaking. At the end of it, this is 35 years ago. There's one brief paragraph on this issue. I don't disagree with the paragraph. It basically says that, well, in the course of this inquiry, we came up with the fact that young black people are overrepresented with schizophrenia and detained in mental health settings, something similar. We note this to be true. We don't fully understand this, and we would just urge that further research is done on the matter in order to obviously alleviate these disparities. Over 3 decades later, exactly the same things are all happening. There are hypotheses that have been advanced. I think the most important hypothesis, it doesn't really take much to understand this, I think the most important hypothesis is that minoritized groups who experience increased level of social adversity in all societies always have higher rates of psychosis or mental health disorder. That's just a fact, whether you look at indigenous populations in Australia or America or Canada, or whether you look at black people in this country, or you look at certain minorities in Asian countries, you will find that minoritized groups always have that. This is called the social adversity hypothesis. It's probably because social adversity leads to a higher level of stress, probably leads to a higher level of certain neurotransmitter release, such as dopamine release, where you end up having to be more hypervigilant and paranoid, even if subtly and incrementally. And ultimately, for some people, that's transformational. Now, there's other things that are probably involved in it as well, including perhaps certain different cultural practices, different attitudes to mental health and health-seeking behavior. Perhaps, I think this has been a bit overplayed, but perhaps different attitudes to recreational drugs and substances. I don't think that accounts for the whole of it. But I think that minority populations are always disadvantaged, and schizophrenia, just proves that. For me, it's just the cardinal biological proof that minoritized populations are a group, or the different race so we always need to look out for our minorities. It's something that we just forget again and again.
And I suppose it's seductive to align the handful of genetics that make up pig skin pigmentation with external behaviours, and much harder to understand nurturing and culture and how that creates us too. The fact that we've got these plastic brains that are constantly adapting to adversity.
I was reading the other day, I think, about Kenya. I'm sure this was about Kenya. Do you know how many ethnic groups there are in Kenya? 200, I think.
Yes.
200. You know, and so just to talk about black people or people of African ancestry, that's a whole continent. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So
you're right. It's seductive, isn't
it's
it?
seductive, but actually it's less likely
Mm,
than something which is if you
yeah.
to use something you said in the last episode. If you change someone up because you've decided they are something, because in this case you were talking about mental health in some countries, then
Mm,
you're going to create certain conditions of behaviour. But I want to get on to
mm,
something which is to do with the violence. Is there something about the violence of these few cases where people are
mm.
violent, they hit the public eye? Is the violence particularly shocking? Is it dramatic violence, or is some of it very subtle?
Mm. You know, this case is really sad. You know, But, these people were innocent.
In this the Nottingham
Yeah, the
case,
Nottingham case. They people were completely innocent. They were complete bystanders. They had no idea of what was about them, and the killings themselves. I mean, I've read the judgments. They were very brutal, right? What I find really interesting, as I said, maybe 10 or 11 years ago, I got more into this because I did that forensic role. Is that all cases are really sad. You know, Jonathan, I've read about people, I've dealt with cases where people have murdered their parents, where people have murdered their wife in front of their children, where somebody's murdered his grandparents. You know, these cases keep coming up again and again. And what has been so surprising to me, you know, since this came onto my radar much more, after I did this job, there were two things that I picked up. One is that the media always misreports the story. Always, I realized that because I was sitting there with the case notes and the witness statements and the police interviews and all of these kind of things, and sometimes the footage and other various things. And what was reported in the press was, that paragraph that doesn't actually tell you exactly what's happened. And the second thing that struck me is how much this is ignored. And so
what do you mean it's
this
ignored? How much?
the, basically between the Zito case and this case,
Yeah, there's not.
as there's been hundreds of these, and but we you wouldn't really know about it.
So
Yeah.
why? Well, I want to know that. Why and why have why did we have a gap? Because we did have a gap. There was probably one or two, but I don't remember them. And then we've had the Zito. I remember, as I say, it was local
Mm.
to me. Then we had Nottingham. Then we had Southport. But what were these things going on in between that or not?
Jonathan, these things have always been going on,
So
and but
why wasn't it being reported?
hmm. Let's think about the Nottingham case, how it came to be reported, right? I'm just, as a citizen of Nottingham, let me tell you how I experienced that day. I get up in the morning. I don't live very far from where the killings took place. Yeah, I have to go past it to drop my kids off to school. I go there, and my kids don't want me to listen to the radio. They hate it when I put on Radio 4, in the morning. So I get to the roundabout, and it's all cordoned off and these kind of things. I put the radio on at the same time, right? And I kind of realized that because they're just talking about Nottingham, 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 and I realized, oh wow, this blockage that I'm dealing with, and I'm really irritated because the kids are going to get late to school. There's some national incident that's going on, right? At that point, in that morning, so I think the murders, the killings, they happen at something like 4 o'clock in the morning, or in the small hours of the morning. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the press has got this idea um, that it might be terrorist related, right? Um, it may be terrorist related, and I think the government of the time, I think Suella Braverman is the Home Secretary. she's coming out and saying things. I can't remember if it was her or others. There are government statements, and there is this kind of rush to this idea. I think everybody's forgotten this now. I remember because I was in the middle trying to work out what was going on. There's this rush to this idea that Nottingham is somehow under attack, which it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't under attack by a terrorist state or a terrorist threat. Sorry. And then over the next subsequent hours, going on to 11 or 12 that morning, there's all this kind of unholy race between the right-wing press to identify essentially the ethnicity of the perpetrator and the background. Something comes out that he's of West African descent. Something else comes out, there's this view that he's probably Muslim. That's what's being suggested. And then I think I don't know, the Daily Telegraph breaks his ethnicity as a scoop first. I think over the Daily Mail, I can't remember, right? Almost as if it's a scoop, right? And there's this kind of outpouring of grief in those hours. Of course, Nottingham, the city of Nottingham, has been very, very worried. There's this outpouring of grief. The next day, I think there is, people attend a memorial for the slain students at the university. Lots of people attend. The Home Secretary attends as well. The Home Secretary is the same Home Secretary who had failed to pick up on previous incidents in Nottingham, and taken proper responsibility for them. But there's something about the public mood which has made this one very different, right? There are pictures, obviously, of the people who are slain, and I think it touches a chord for lots of people. So this is how it came to become important, and as aspects are understood more and more about the case over time, we also have relatives of the victims who are quite forceful and assertive in getting their view out. But it's also, I think, that they are given a platform, by media organizations who want to hear what they have to say. And so the story gathers momentum, right? That doesn't always happen, Jonathan, in every case. And in many of the hundreds of cases where there have been absolute tragedies, it hasn't happened,
So are you saying we can almost write the formula for the perfect mental health violent case to capture the nation's attention? Is it almost formulaic?
Yeah, I don't know if one could say it's formulaic, but I think there are, a few years ago, it's not that just mental health. A few years ago, there was a lady called Sarah Everard. You may remember, she died, right? There were certain aspects to that story which caught the popular imagination.
This
right?
was someone killed by a police officer, wasn't it? Or was that
I believe so.
Well, certainly they leaked photos. The police leaked photos of the scene, didn't they?
I think that might be different. With Sarah Everard, I think she was a victim of clear misogyny. She was killed by a police officer.
Mm-hmm.
There were vigils, as I recall.
Yeah.
All of these kind of some of these cases capture the popular imagination, right? And some don't. And Jonathan, at the end of the day, having also met newspaper editors and other people, you know what I mean, and understanding that some of them are actually extremely shallow, journalists.
I think this doesn't help. I honestly don't think this helps at all, because what you're trying to say is getting lost, because you're suddenly dispersing people who edit newspapers. They're not shallow. They just have a different way of seeing the things. But no one's shallow. Who's shallow?
Let me get to let me refine the point.
No, because you've totally come off track. I was just trying to find out why some things got in the media and others didn't, and all of a sudden it's to do with shallow newspaper editors. I don't think it is.
Well, I think
there's certain things going on.
I get that. Okay, perhaps I'm too ready to be dismissive. What I would say is that there are certain avenues to a story becoming big, and there are certain avenues to it not being big, right? And those avenues are sometimes related to the way the media works, the way that publicity works, and what makes good copy.
But we've just fallen into the same trap. I'm really frustrated. We've been talking for 35 minutes. We were going to talk about the violence, and all of a sudden, we talk about the whole circus around the violence. And I think it's very symbolic of what goes on. Sure. I wanted to actually understand how violence develops in mental health, the effect of it. I wanted to understand the effect of it on those who are close to the victims. I wanted to understand the effect of it on other people. But instead, the gravitational pull of the sensation, the gravitational pull of what the media talk about, the gravitational pull of political agendas to do with this, that, and the other, we're being drawn back into the rut of ways of speaking, which means we're not thinking around the question. We're just repeating the same old themes. So what I want to do is something different. I want to take the chance to actually understand the violence, because none of that. I'm sitting here and I've listened to all of that and I'm no wiser whatsoever, which is exactly where I started. So I'm going to ask you, as a psychiatrist, I want to understand the violence that's going on, and I want to understand it from a pictorial point of view. How does it affect, as a psychiatrist, when you see this, how does it affect you? And I'll tell you as a non-psychiatrist how it affects me, but how does it affect you?
What's the question? Is it how it affects me, or is it how does it develop?
First, how does it develop, and then how it affects you?
How it often develops, often in schizophrenia or psychosis, not exclusively, is it develops in the context of a person who feels under threat, who feels the self or integrity under threat, experiencing persecutory delusions, feeling that they have to do something to either keep themselves safe, or to act out on the voices that they're experiencing, that because they're overwhelming, they need the voices to stop. That's their internal reality. Does that make sense?
And that externalizes, in a very few cases, that externalizes as a extremely violent act against other people.
It can do, yes.
Do we know why that would be?
People will react to the same set of stimuli in very different ways, isn't it? Some people will withdraw and run away, and most people actually will try and avoid conflict and run away. Some people will try and take it head on, if they feel that they're under threat or attack, or that they can be commanded to do things by aliens or God or these kind of things, right? And they will act out on that, so it's really interesting. There's something about what's happening in your internal biology, but there's also your psychology or your makeup of how you interpret those same stimuli. Does that make sense?
Is there a parallel with what just happened between you and me? I got so frustrated that this whole thing wasn't it was overpowering, and I went, enough. I don't want to do this anymore. Is there a parallel there with someone where, of course, this is at a totally different level, and as you say, they need to protect their integrity. The act of violence is often in these cases an act of protection, not an act of random arbitrary violence of one person against another.
I think the other thing you have to remember, Jonathan, is that people who are psychotic or experiencing under the throes of psychosis may not perfectly interview you. They may not perfectly be open to interrogation. It may be that they regret elements of what they did, or they don't want to say those things out loud. They may be experiencing voices which might be telling them not to say these things. And so one's interrogation of the internal phenomena of what is happening in psychosis or schizophrenia is sometimes incomplete. Well, many times incomplete and partial. And you pick up things from what the individual may have been saying or doing, or the comments he may have passed afterwards, to understand the delusional system. I or anybody who's trying to interrogate that delusional system cannot interrogate every little aspect of it or every avenue, but you can understand enough to understand this is something highly distressing for this
Okay.
individual.
And
Yeah.
that's this now brings me to those affected by it, because there's only so far we can get inside what's going on. So how do we react to it? And the place I'd like to start is actually those families. As you point out, in Nottingham, those families were very vocal. Perhaps some people wanted to mobilise that what they were saying, but that had nothing really to do with them. They were in the thick of it. See, the problem here is when these things happen, we're asking those people who are involved in managing it to then be the judges of how it's dealt with. So the mental health services have their part to play, and they can judge how the mental health services, the police will have their part to play, but they judge the police. I can imagine for a family affected or friends affected, I'm going to see a heck of a lot of bureaucracy. I'm going to see a heck of a lot which looks like cover up. I'm going to have a lot of people not taking responsibility. A lot of people saying, we'll wait for the inquiry. We're kicking the can down the road, even though in a sense we have to wait for the inquiry. It must be not only painful, it must be unbelievably frustrating and infuriating.
I think that's exactly what they have said. They have said this in the media repeatedly, and actually they've been saying this in the inquiry themselves. Where I think they've given a much fuller account by the nature of inquiries. They've been able to express much more clearly, and you can see the frustration, the feelings of cover up, the anger, the incompetence, and all of these things that's certainly there,
So what
and that's
does that
very much been foregrounded. Yeah.
So what does that tell us about ourselves as we live in a place where there's been a long 1,000 years of history of mental health, of serious mental illness, where we might only come up with a diagnosis recently, but there's been behaviours which have been similar to this behaviour. And as we confront that as a society, what does it mean where we leave the families feeling like that? Who are we as a society who leave the families, and who are we as institutions, particularly
But
who leave the
Jonathan,
families there?
I think that one of the things, just to add to that though, is that there's another set of victims in all of this, yeah, whose experience has been much foregrounded, much less, and that is the perpetrator's family, who were raising concerns for a long time about his mental health, felt they weren't being understood, and have now lost the son to serious mental illness and institutionalization and all of this, right? And in a way, what's really interesting is their pain is also extremely deep and profound and very complex. There has been a documentary about it. But their difficulties have not been foreshadowed so much. And so I just put it to you, Jonathan, that there is a high. I don't mean this in a bad way. It's an observation. There is a hierarchy of victimhood. It's easier to understand some people's pain than it is to understand more complex pain. And some voices then become more important than other voices. As a psychiatrist, I would say that one of the most important voices is the patient's family. Always. Do you know what was going on for that person at the time? But that hasn't been necessarily how it's always been reported on for, and I think quite understandable reasons. So we can't deconstruct this violence and how it's affected us as a society without asking questions about ourselves as a society and our attitudes to violence, our attitudes to the perpetrators of it, and our attitudes to, who is innocent, who is culpable, who's not guilty. Does that make sense? All of this reveals, in some sense, lots of what we think about ourselves and lots of what we think about violence, and some rather, I would argue, simplistic notions of violence underpinning it. There's a victim, there's a perpetrator. The perpetrator must be evil, the perpetrator must be a monster, the victim must be innocent. And those related to the victim must be innocent. Those related to the perpetrator, not so innocent. There are, so violence does this to society. It brings all of this out.
Yeah, I mean, and there's, I think it was called Riches, came up with a triangle of violence with victim, perpetrator, witness. But of course, once
Okay.
again, nice geometric shape, the triangle, very popular to describe something else. Whereas there's an interplay of many roles, and there's different witnesses, and there's different victims, and the victims might also be witnesses, and the perpetrator might be a witness of other things. They are a witness of what they're doing. So, and it's not just one-way interaction. It's not some abstract thing going on in a ring somewhere. So the family are central, but the family, as we know from Stockport or seem to understand, is they're also involved in the mental health issue themselves, as society might be. So society's creating behaviours around a person, and they're interacting with society. The family is a whole set of behaviours. Then there's these institutions which are meant to come in and treat the individual. They're not meant to treat society, and they're not really meant to treat the family. They're just meant to treat the individual. And the family are not the individual, so they only get limited access. But perhaps some professionals will give them more access than others, and perhaps sometimes they should have less access than others, because depending on what's going on. So we're getting all this going on, which is why I really don't like if you like, the simplistic media output on it, because all that's going on. But if this is how we live, who are we? We live with this. These aren't isolated incidents. These are a continuum. Okay, fortunately, it's not all the time, and some of the time, fortunately, it's not all the time. It's because the mental health services are getting it right. The families are getting it right. Society's kind of getting it right. But when these things occur, as you say, there's always a way to trace back the causes of the accident where things have gone wrong. What does it mean that we live amongst that and just accept this way of instant inquiry, upset aggravation, instant inquiry, upset aggravation? Because in all of this, what I never get is what a society, the inquiry never goes as well as society. Everyone, listen up. This is what we suggest you do. Families, listen up. This is what we think you should do.
Inquiries have never blamed the culture. and culture is probably the determining. I mean, you might have the culture of police or the culture of mental health services. Needs to change, right? But essentially, culture of society and how we see things underpins everything that happens. It's one of the most massive determinants of what actually goes on. And I mean, there's many parallels in this inquiry. We can talk about it at a later stage, and perhaps we will. But yeah,
but I can hear people object to that, saying, "Hey, don't blame us. We're nothing to do with this." But what I'm trying to say in that is, well, we are something to do with this. How are we meant to be around mental health? What is it?
Jonathan,
how do we learn it?
Have you ever considered what blame actually is?
Good question. Tell me
blame more. Is a projection. If I blame you, I throw it to you, right? It's nothing to do with me. What happened was because of you. Blame is a very powerful way of deflecting one's own responsibility onto somebody else. I differentiate blame from taking responsibility. I'm not saying, of course, that police services, mental health services, and all these other services shouldn't take responsibility for what happened. They should take responsibility. They should learn from what happened and put steps in place to make sure these things don't happen again. That's very different. It's very different difficult to disentangle that from a very natural and human response, which is to look for somebody to blame and to look for somebody to hang. And that happens all the time. And in these inquiries, and this is part of the reason for burnout within mental health services, actually. The conversation this is a very high level inquiry, but inquiries, investigations happen all the time. The conversation is always, well, we're just looking to understand the lessons and what are the lessons learned and how we can do things better. It's very difficult to disentangle it from blaming, finding somebody to blame, to pin it all on them. And once you've pinned it all on that person, which might be a doctor or a nurse or whoever,
just carry
then
on.
it's okay.
Yeah.
You just carry on.
Well, that's it. So that's exactly it. That's what I'm trying to get at. Nothing really changes when we do that. But I'm interested. We've not got time for it today, but I want to take it up because we talked about family and we talked about these people growing up, and we talked about family getting frustrated and not getting the services help. We talked about family possibly contributing towards the problem. And we have these issues of what do these families do when they're noticing a problem? Because, of course, it's quite easy to blame and say, well, in that case, they did the wrong thing. How do they know what the right thing was? Or in this case, they were complaining to the services. Well, they complained in the wrong way. If they come to me, I don't know how it works. So what I'd like to do in another episode, maybe the one after this, is to have a look at that, is to look at mental health from a family's point of view and what that would mean. I used to work with someone a long, long time ago, and his sister, occasionally was sectioned, and I still remember it was so hard for him. It was so hard. So I'd really like to look at that, and we live quite near somewhere where some kids were radicalised. I don't like that phrase at all, so I'll not say it. I'll take that back. They weren't radicalised. Something went on in that family, and the kids went off to war, to fight as soldiers, as they saw it. And these things go. I'd really like to look at that, and we don't have time. But are you okay to discuss it in the next one?
Of course. I wonder, Jonathan.
Which means if you want to watch it, you're going to have to subscribe.
Of course,
because then you'll get to see it.
Jonathan, just one question. It was the wrong war, wasn't it? It wasn't the right war.
That's a whole different discussion.
I know. Of course it is. Of course it is.
Well, it's possibly is there right war? Right, maybe. Was there right?
Yes, of course.
On we go. All right, let's leave it there. Musa, thank you very much.
Thank you
for your perspective. I really do appreciate it. I hope other people do too. Subscribe. We'll take it places.
Okay. Thank you.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.